and lasting example of the utilitarian architecture of America's wooden age. An age when craftsmen, using simple tools, were able to fashion machines that worked with the precision of clocks and often resembled them in complexity. The windmill was restored by a community-wide effort in 1987, culminating a rugged history that dates back to 1800. During the intervening years, it has been a functional mill, a picturesque community centerpiece, a regional landmark, and now a cultural resource for all. To understand the importance of windmills in this region, one has to go back over 2 centuries to when the dominant way of life was farms and farming. Milling was an essential service, providing grist for cattle feed and flour for bread. The origin of the windmill at Watermill was in 1799, when shipowner James Mitchell petitioned the board of Southampton Town for the right to build a mill on Hog Neck, a windy stretch of land near Sag Harbor that we now call North Haven. Permission was granted, and a mill was built there that began to grind in 1800. In 1813, the mill was sold to James Corwith of Watermill. In the age of wood craftsmanship, structures were often disassembled and moved from location to location. According to records, Corwith moved the windmill with 12 yoke of oxen in the fall of the same year from Hog Neck, across Short Beach and Long Beach, through the woods to Watermill, where it still stands today on the village green, the oldest and best example of early Long Island windmills. The mill is a smock-type mill, named after a linen overgarment worn by English countrymen. A telling feature of all smock mills is that the cap on top of the permanent tower of the mill is movable and can be turned into the wind. This type of mill dominated New England and Long Island during the 18th and 19th centuries. The mill at Watermill, however, was unique, for it incorporated characteristics of the earlier post-mill construction. The windmill at Watermill, for example, has a tail pole, common for post mills but highly unusual for smock mills, especially on Long Island. Also, the mill has a dead curb, a construction characteristic where the cap sat directly on the tower, separated only by a thin layer of grease. Historically, the dead curb was replaced by the live curb, as in the BB mill built in 1820, where a series of rollers were inserted between the cap and tower to facilitate movement. One theory suggests that the integration of the tail pole and dead curb in this windmill was because its original location on Hog Neck was subject to severe tailwinds, and the tail pole and dead curb both contributed to increased stability. While this blending of earlier construction types was not common on Long Island, it was popular in New England, where on Cape Cod and Nantucket, there are 7 mills built at the same time that are almost identical. This similarity appears more than a coincidence. It underscores the exchange of ideas that was common between the 2 regions at the beginning of the 19th century. While there is no direct information on who built the windmill now at Watermill, tradition in that day would indicate that it was constructed by local wood craftsmen familiar with mills and mill-writing techniques. In the mill's reconstruction in Watermill, it appears the only change Corwith made after moving the mill was the adding of a second set of millstones seen here, replacing a single drive system that was originally in the mill. Corwith paid $750 for the mill, roughly the going rate for mills at that time. The mill at Gardiner's Island, seen here, was built for $773 in 1795. Watermill at this time was a small farming community in which there was a constant demand for milling that would grind the corn and oats and wheat grown in the local fields into grist for cattle feed and flour for bread. In an attempt to expand understanding of the mill and how it operated, a group of volunteers who had been involved in the restoration met to share information with local citizens and youngsters, some of whom were descendants of James Corwith, the original miller. Clay Corwith, a high school student who worked on the restoration, explains here how the sails are readied for action.
We bring the sails out of the mill, and we take the sails out of the bag. and set them up on the ground. Once we have all the sails laid out, ready to go, we have someone go inside and release the brake on the windmill blades so we can turn them till one of them is straight up into the air. And then they put the brake back on while someone climbs up and ties all the ropes around on the back of the arms in a fashion that they won't slide, so that the sail will stay on there nice and tight. When the wind blows, it won't get loose and start flying off of there. They put the sails on so it catches lots of wind and gets the blades going about 25 times a minute, where the grain will grind nice and fine.
If the mill was not facing the wind, the cap would be turned by pushing the tail pull. On days when a dozen kids weren't available, it was turned by a mule with a combined energy of several men. The sound of the mill is formidable, and its power impressive. Adam Halsey, on the top floor, explains the process that goes on in the mill once the sails are moving in the wind.
The sails that are outside, and they turn in a counterclockwise motion, and it comes in on this wind shaft, and the wind shaft is connected to the brake. And all these little teeth on the brake go into the teeth right down here on the lantern pinion wallower, and they go down on the vertical shaft that turns that big wheel, and they all mesh with the little wallower that's downstairs on either side.
How fast does this turn up in a stiff breeze?
The wind shaft comes in and it has about 25 RPMs and about 50 horse. And as it goes down into the different high gearings inside of it, it gets to be about 80 to 100 RPMs.
Why did they have two stones in the mill?
One was usually for grist and one was for flour.
I see.
And they're two different things, and you can't use the same stones without changing the setup.
One of the regular maintenance duties in the mill is greasing the dead curb.
On the dead curb, you have to grease it every once in a while to make sure that the cap will spin freely and it won't get stuck when the boards swell and warp together.
On the second floor, Clay Corwith describes the actual grinding process.
The grain comes down through here, comes down into this little tray here, and sprinkles that down in the eye of the stone, where it goes between the two stones and gets all flattened out and ground up really fine, and pours that downstairs into a bag.
Another essential maintenance activity is dressing the stones. Tom White, one of the most active volunteers in the restoration, demonstrates how the miller had to dismantle the gearing to get to the stones in order to dress them, a process involving sharpening the cutting edges of the furrows. Here he uses a bill, a special cutting tool used in dressing and redressing millstones.
We're raising the stone so that periodically, depending upon the grinding, depending upon how fine we make the flour, depends on how close the stones run. If they run very close, then they touch each other and wear down. So once a week, the miller would have to work on the stone. This pair of stones weighs a little in excess of a ton. This kept the miller very busy, even while the mill was not working. There was work for the miller to do.
On the ground floor is the controlling mechanism for the stones.
This is the governor, and the governor's on these as the wind comes in originally, the power comes in from the wind shaft, originally from the sails, comes down, and the RPMs get going a lot faster. The stones are originally a certain distance apart, and the grain goes in, and it's cutting fine. But as it gets going faster, then the grain's in there a lot less. So the governor will raise up, and the stones will come closer together. As the stones are pushed together and the corn is fed through it, the fine powder is pushed outward, and it comes down through this chute and This is what it comes out of as the cracked corn.
You can take this home and make corn muffins, cornbread. Have you ever had cornbread? It's delicious.
The corn that we ground the other day, they had some and they made some corn muffins out of it. And when you ate it, there was a little stone in it.
That's what the Miller's children ate?
Well, everybody back in those days had chickens. And they probably gave it to the chickens, and then eventually it all came around again.
Okay. That's good.
The restoration of the mill between 1985 and 1987 was under the supervision of millwright James Cricker. Hundreds of community volunteers were involved in fundraising and direct labor on the windmill, activities that brought friends together in common purpose and community
I
pride.
came down with my hammer and my tools and a payloader, and I rode up in that as I shingled the sides, and different people did other sides, and we custom cut the corners to fit, and it came out beautiful.
It's scary to go upstairs when it's working like that.
Got it going about 30 times a minute. It did get scary, and that grain poured out.
How are you related to this building?
This mill? My great-great-great-great-grandfather brought it here.
4 grades ago.